So yes, hello, good evening, everyone. So we're going to talk about biosecurity in our chalk streams. So the running order is me first, and then Tom is going to talk about his section, largely crayfish, and Andy's going to talk about fish, and it's all got a biosecurity theme. I'm going to go through a definition of biosecurity. This is my section. And then I'm going to talk a little bit about the difference between native, non-native and invasive non-native species, because these are some of the terms that are used when people are talking about biosecurity. I think it's helpful to know the difference between them. And then I'll talk about what the problem is with specifically invasive non-native species, and then what we do to help our chalk streams and what you can do to make sure you're being biosecure around chalk streams. I was thinking, what does biosecurity mean? What does it mean to you? You don't have to answer, but if you can have a think about it. As I was thinking about it, I ended up looking up on the internet, and it's a very broad definition. People use it for different things depending on their industry or what they're looking at. In terms of chalk streams, biosecurity is what we're doing, measures we take to stop the introduction or the movement of plants or animals or organisms like disease, to minimize that entering into the wider environment. And on chalk streams, this is really, really important. The streams, most of you know this already, but they're globally rare. They're a really rare habitat. There are 223 chalk streams in the world. The World Wildlife Fund have counted them all, and 160 of them are here in England. So we've got just under 80% of the world's chalk streams. They have a really unique habitat because of the geology and the way the water comes out of the chalk. So we have a lot of species that are really specialised. They are adapted to living in these unique environments. We call them Goldilocks rivers because, well, they're sensitive to change. So they don't like it too shaded. They don't like it too light. They need just the right amount of plants in and the right types of plants. And if you change something about a chalk stream, especially if you change something that will impact the plants, you start to lose that biodiversity and the structure of the river. And you'll very quickly end up with what can look like a desert in terms of your chalk stream environment. And we're in the middle of a biodiversity crisis and the climate change, and these are going to just threaten our chalk streams even more. So I'm going to go through the three terms that we use: native, non-native, and invasive non-native. Sometimes you'll see it written down as INS, INNS. We tend to use that quite a lot in our project. So that's just the acronym for invasive non-native species. And I've put two pictures up here. So there's two plants that you find on our chalk streams in our headwaters. As you're looking at them, you're sort of thinking, well, one of them is an invasive plant and is an invasive non-native plant, and one of them is a native plant. And the one on the left, the mare's tail, that is a native plant that we would expect to see. It's one of the 4 types of plants that you expect to see on a chalk stream. And very often people don't know that, or they think it looks a bit alien and it shouldn't be there. But it is definitely something that we want to see on our chalk streams, especially where the water is a bit slower. The plant on the right is monkey flower. That is a plant that we really don't want to see, and I spend a lot of time working with people to remove that from chalk streams. So you can see here, it's not always about what it looks like, it's more about the plant and is it in the right place. So going back to the terms, when we talk about natives and non-natives, how do we know, is it a native and what makes it a native plant? And to do this, you have to go back to the Ice Age. When we were in the grips of the last ice age, because there was so much water tied up in all the ice sheets and the glaciers, our sea levels were much lower. And in this picture, you can see this sort of greenish beige outline. This was the extent of the land mass in the middle of the ice age. And as the ice started to retreat, you ended up with more of a tundra-like landscape, and seeds were able to blow in and then take root. Mosses started to grow, and very sort of weedy plants would start to grow first, and then eventually some of the trees would start to establish. And this is a an ecological process called succession. So you see this happening on any sort of bare patch of land. You get little mosses and all sort of like dandelion type weeds first, and then they make a bit more soil, and then something bigger can come in, and it's a natural process. And this would have been happening across this tundra-like landscape. And this happens very slowly, and the IPCC, the International Panel of Climate Change, have a booklet that tells you how quickly plants and animals can move into and out of a landscape. So plants obviously take a longer time, but also you would have had animals moving in naturally following this rate of succession. Now, as the ice started to melt, obviously the sea levels rose, and eventually it punctured through, and we had what we know now as the Channel, and that cut us off from mainland Europe. And that's where we then say we have our established native ecology. They're the animals and plants that came here naturally through that slow migration in, and then we became cut off. We've also got non-native or sometimes naturalized species. They're things that came across or were brought into the UK by people. So it was either accidentally, say like seeds and burrs caught on clothing or in hair, or people who brought something in, like, for example, a picture at the bottom, the apples. They're not a native species, or something that people brought in as a crop, or probably brought animals in, or maybe animals that hitched a ride in boats, anything that was brought in after the Ice Age. And some of these things live quite comfortably in our landscape. They're part of our ecology. They're part of our community of plants and animals. They don't really have a massive impact. I've put here they might fill a niche. That is a space in the ecological community. There's a space there for them to fulfill a part of all the plants and animals that are living together. And we've got about 3,000 different species. We've got a beech tree, and that's goldenrod, the plants. There's lots of plants and animals that live here that are naturalized. And then we have invasive non-native species. And these are also plants and animals that were brought here by people and our activities. But they are different. They cause damage to habitats, they change ecology, they'll change biodiversity, and they cost us money in terms of they might reduce a crop or something that we want, or they cost a lot of money because of us having to get rid of them. And this is all about ecology. So these invasive non-native plants, the problem ones, they've come from somewhere else where they've had very specific adaptations to their environment that is very different to ours. I've put here an example of Japanese knotweed. So Japanese knotweed is a really big problem here in the UK. If you have a stand of it and you agitate it or you try and dig it out, for example, its response is to spread and grow even more robust. And that's because it evolved in the mountains of Japan, where it is evolved to cope with that. So that if there's a landslide or some volcanic activity, it will cope and survive up there. Interestingly, if you have that then spreading down into the urban areas of Japan, it is as big a problem there as it is here. So, and also I've put here that UK species can be a problem somewhere else. So it's not just about all these invasive plants coming in here. Some of our plants that have evolved to our communities or our habitats, they're a problem in other places. So the European starling that we want to have here and is a native, and we love seeing them, a handful of them were taken to Central Park in New York in the 1860s, and they did really well, and they're now classed as an invasive non-native species in North America. Why are these a problem, and why do we want to think about biosecurity around them? These are things, plants or animals, that grow faster or bigger than native plants. They access resources really, really efficiently and effectively. So that means a resource would be sunlight or nutrients in the soil or water, or space or a mate or some way of spreading seeds. They will also, in terms of animals, they might overpredate native animals, which happens with, for example, American mink and waterfoals. There are some people who are worried that some of the invasive non-native plants might overly attract pollinating insects away from native plants. So then over time, you'd have less pollination of native plants and less success of those native plants. So, and potentially the pollinating insects would be having a major part of their diet from one plant. And that's a bit like us just living off, say, pizzas. You know, it's not healthy. So it could be a dual impact on pollinating insects. And finally, they're not really kept in check by natural predators or disease because they're not in their native environment where they might be kept in check, and where they're here in the wrong place, they'll just do really well and become a problem. So if you have a think about what might the costs be to the UK government, 1.4, 1.7 or 1.9 billion, it's estimated to be 1.7 billion every year. Now, I think this is actually an underestimation because I've been using this slide for a few years. I haven't seen it anywhere say any different. Logically, it's more than this. And we're paying for this. We are also paying in terms of our time because most of this removal is done by volunteers. And there are lots of people in this audience who've helped us remove invasive plants. So in Whitchurch last year, I worked out that we spent 231 hours pulling out Himalayan balsam, and we'll have to keep going back. This is a real burden in terms of time and effort and the financial cost. So anything we can do to stop this by our biosecurity awareness and making sure we're doing the right thing will be a real impact, a positive impact. So I just put up a few little pictures here to think about, well, what does that really mean to a chalk stream? So I've got a little diagram here of a fake chalk stream. So you've got some resources I was talking about, some rain and the sunlight. We've got the black plants here, the native plants. We've got a lovely, healthy, gravelly chalk stream with some fish eggs and invertebrates and native plants here. A little bit of sediment that you want at the side. And then you've got a native plant arriving, a seed has grown, and we've got our pollinators pollinating the native plants. It's all looking very lovely. Then over the time in the summer, those non-native plants start to dominate because they're accessing the resources really efficiently, and they're casting shade over the native plants, which are now starting to not do so well. And especially in chalk streams, this is a problem. If there's too much shade, you'll lose the plants. A bit more soil's coming in. Some of the invertebrates aren't doing so well. The fish are struggling because there's not enough food, so they've gone off. And then the pollinating insects are being attracted to the non-native plants, doing well off there. And then in the winter, when those things start to die back, especially with Himalayan balsam, it leaves bare soil. This is a problem on chalk streams because we don't want soil to get into the rivers and the streams and the winterbournes. So you've got not a lot of plants here now holding that soil in place. And when it starts to get windy and rainy, the soil can very easily come into the river. And you've already got the impact from the plants in the summer, which is less fish, less invertebrates, and more sediment. And this is what's happening on chalk streams, these invasive plants. They alter ecosystems and they reduce biodiversity. You might not see it with one or two plants, but once they get established, they can very quickly start to dominate and they will reduce biodiversity in chalk streams. We have 12 plants that we are targeting with watercress and winterbournes. Some of them are in italics because they're on Schedule 9, Part 2 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act. It's an offence to allow them to spread and to plant these plants. And so we target all of these. Some of them we do with volunteer groups, as in the two pictures on the right. That was us taking out something called parrot's feather. And we took two massive piles out. That's one pile at the bottom there. We took two of those piles out. Some of the plants we can't touch because they're either toxic to humans or because the way you get rid of them involves injecting them with insecticides, and it's very difficult to treat them on a river. So you need to understand what can you do about them. How are invasive non-native species spread? So it's by what we do in and around rivers. So I've got a picture there of muddy wellies. If you're someone who likes to go for walks or works in and around rivers, make sure your boots and your equipment is clean, scrupulously clean. We make sure at the Trust that we scrub all of the mud out of the tread of our boots when we're walking in the rivers or working in the rivers. If we don't have to get into the river, we won't. And that's because if you've got mud on under your shoes and wellies, mud can stay damp for a very long time. And if there's disease in the mud or the soil or the water, that can be trapped in there and can last for a long time. And also seeds will be in the treads or on your clothes, and plant fragments can be on your clothes. I've seen that happen when we've been doing some projects. So it's really important to check your clothing and your boots on site, and then when you take them home, wash them. Hot soapy water is fine. Sometimes we use a little bit of diluted, some other cleaning agent. But the main thing is that you let it all dry properly before you go back into the river, because any disease and the fragments will then not be on your clothing. And also one other tip is, if you're working on the river and you know you've got to go to, say, 3 different sites on a stretch of river, we'd always recommend you start at the most upstream point, so as closest to the source of the river, so that whatever you're doing, if you then move further downstream, it would have, and there was something in like a plant or a disease in the river, it would naturally move downstream. Whereas if you go downstream and you have something on your clothing and then you go upstream, you'll be moving something around artificially in that river. We also check stuff that's in our nets and make sure we just check all of our clothing and our boots on site. So make sure you look at things and you notice what's on your bodies or your clothing, so that you're as biosecure as possible. And what to do about invasive non-native species? My top tip always is keep inquiring and learning. Keep finding out as much as possible, because you'll always find out more about the plants and you'll become more and more observant. You'll be able to talk to other people about them. Check and stop the spread. So that's reiterating what I've just talked about, checking seeds and plants on your clothing and in your boots. Find out if it's a plant that's on Schedule 9, or if you are able to touch it or not touch it. Is it something that is toxic? Find out as much as you can. Don't just assume you should go and tackle it. Find out more about that first. Some of these plants, like giant hogweed, will give you very, very nasty blisters, life-changing chemical burns, if you like. So it's important that you know what you're doing. So my tip would be to report it to the Environment Agency or a group like us, so that we know where it is and can have another look and see what's the most appropriate course of action. And you could become a volunteer. If there's a group near where you live and they're tackling something like this, and it's a space that you really feel passionate about, go and join in and help. It can be fun. It's quite hard work at times, but you know that you're doing something that's important to you and your friends locally. If you find something that you think is an invasive plant, some people have an app on there's a variety of them, but some people have an app on their phone. But I would say take lots of photos. Don't just take one and think I'll send that in later, because very often they're out of focus, or it might be you need to take a picture of the leaf to identify it or something unusual. So take a few photos. If you can find the location, so we use something called What 3 Words, or you can pinpoint it on a map and tell somebody about it. And then notice, is it just one plant or a group of plants? What sort of size is it? That helps people decide what to do about it. You can have a chat with the landowner if you've got a really good relationship with them, or the Environment Agency, or someone like Hampshire Flora Group. There might be a biodiversity group where you are, who would be able to take the data and share it with the appropriate group of people so that we can tackle it.
Hello, everybody. My name is Tom Selby. I'm an assistant ecologist at Hampshire and Wight Wildlife Trust, and I'm very fortunate that a lot of my work for more than a decade now has been involved with white-clawed crayfish and the conservation of that species. So white-clawed crayfish, they are a decapod crustacean with 10 legs and 2 large claws at the front. So if you've never seen one before, they're almost like a small lobster. The UK's only native species of freshwater crayfish, but unfortunately they are both nationally and internationally endangered. They're found in mainland Europe and in Britain, but they're endangered in both places. So for that reason, they're given protection under both UK and European legislation. So they were protected under the European Habitats Directive, which was then subsequently transposed into UK law in 2017 as part of the Conservation of Habitats and Species regulations. And they are also protected under Schedule 5 of the Wildlife and Countryside Act. Now, because of these protections, it's necessary to have a license from Natural England to survey or trap or handle this species. And also because of their endangered status, they are a qualifying feature for the designation of the river urchin as a special area of conservation and also as a site of special scientific interest. Some key characteristics for identifying a crayfish as a native white-clawed crayfish is they're generally a brown or olive coloration. They can sometimes be blue. We're not entirely sure what the reason for this is. It often happens to them when they're in captivity. So we think it's something to do with water chemistry. But generally the ones we see out in the wild are a brown or olive coloration. They can grow up to 12 centimeters in length, but generally are smaller than this, usually about 8 to 10 centimeters. And then the chile or claws, you can see here that underneath they have this very pale coloration, ranges from a white to a sort of rosy pink. And this is what gives them the name white-clawed crayfish. And they also have a slight orangey coloration to the tips of the claws there. The claws also have a generally rough, granular texture. You can sort of make that out in the picture here. Another identifying feature, which generally is only noticeable when you have them in the hand, is a series of very small spines here. They can just be made out in the picture that run along this part of the anatomy known as the cervical groove. But generally in smaller individuals, those you can only really notice them by feeling them under your thumb as you handle them. So they used to be fairly widely distributed in Hampshire. Prior to 2003, as this map says, it used to be in the northeast, in these rivers here. They used to be down in parts of the New Forest, used to be in the River Meon. But since the mid to late 1970s, they've suffered a 90% population decline. And so these days, the main stronghold for white-clawed crayfish in Hampshire is on the headwaters of the River Itchen chalk stream. So you've got the Candover stream, which runs to the north, Cheriton stream, which runs to the south from New Alresford, and the River Isle, which runs from the east. There's also a very small and localized relic population on the River Test, on the River Anton tributary there, that was found within the last decade. And we thought that as far as white-clawed crayfish in Hampshire, that was all we had left until January of last year. We had the sudden rediscovery of this population on our own Winnell Moors Nature Reserve in Winchester, which came as something of a surprise. So this was in a small back channel right in the north of the reserve. One day, Rachel Remnant, our reserves officer, and some of her volunteers were out doing some work in this channel that had become a bit overgrown with willows, which were leaning into the channel, and off of the branches where root balls were growing. So they were pulling some of these out in order to aid the conveyance of water down this little channel. and suddenly found that there were crayfish tumbling out of the root ball. They had a bit of a panic because initially they thought they were a non-native species, but they were able to get some video and photographs to my colleague Ben Rushbrook, and he said in this rather blurry video, well, that looks like a white-clawed crayfish. So he dashed over there as it was getting quite dark on this January evening, and was able to confirm that, yeah, these were white-clawed crayfish on our reserve in Winchester. So then last summer I led a survey program on the reserve on this channel where they were found, and then some channels nearby. I was able to find more than 70 individuals spread across 3 different channels, found them at all different life stages. So some tiny individuals that were young that were born that year, and right up to adults that were among the largest we've ever recorded in Hampshire, which suggests that these individuals are getting on for 10 years old, if not more. So it's a fairly well-established population. There were surveys done in 2009 and 10 of channels very nearby, and nothing was ever found. And it was considered that the species had been lost from there in the early 1990s. So it does raise the prospect that could there be other relic populations hiding out in other parts of the county. We keep our fingers crossed for more such discoveries. But the drivers of decline of white-clawed crayfish in Hampshire and in the country as a whole have been a number of things. There's been loss of habitat, so degradation and over-engineering of river channels, particularly things like dredging during World War II, and then straightening of river channels for canalization. There's also the impact of pollutants, so they can be affected by runoff of chemicals and pesticides. White-clawed crayfish can be affected by excessive silt or sediment runoff. If there's too much silt in the water, it can build up in their gills and affect their ability to breathe. And they are also highly susceptible to organic pollutants, because white-clawed crayfish need a high available amount of dissolved oxygen in the water. So any organic pollutant from agriculture and other wastewater systems, for instance, can have a severe impact on white-clawed crayfish, and they're also susceptible to things like nitrates and excess phosphates. Another impact can be over abstraction of water from the rivers for consumption and human use, particularly as the main remaining populations we have in Hampshire are up on the chalk streams right up in the top of the Itchen, these little tributaries, which if more water is taken from the rivers, then these are the areas that can be most affected. But by far the biggest driver and accelerator of the decline of white-clawed crayfish in the UK since the mid to late 1970s has been non-native crayfish, or another acronym for you, non-indigenous crayfish species, otherwise known as NICs. There are 7 of these species known to be in the wild in the UK. In Hampshire, the main one of these is the signal crayfish. I expect many of you will have heard about this. So this is a species which comes from North America. It was introduced in the 1970s to a lot of fish farm ponds and small channels as a way of people making money, essentially. They were introduced for propagation and then to be sold into things like the restaurant trade, because they grow very quickly, breed very quickly. But unfortunately, these signal crayfish rapidly escaped from these ponds that they were introduced into. They tend to travel over the land very readily, much more readily than the native white-clawed crayfish. So they hopped from pond to pond, lake to lake, and then once they got into the rivers, they spread through those catchments and moved from catchment to catchment very easily. So now they're pretty widespread throughout the whole country, and widespread in Hampshire. They are known to be throughout the mid to lower Itchen, through much of the main river test. And unfortunately, in 2017, we were able to confirm that they were present in the River Isle tributary at the top of the Itchen, so very close to our native white-clawed crayfish populations. There are a larger and behaviorally more aggressive species than the native crayfish, so they're able to outcompete them for resources. They will predate them. So when you have the two species living alongside one another, over time, the white-clawed crayfish will be pushed out in favour of the signal crayfish. They tend to be a reddish brown or bluish coloration and can grow up to 15 centimetres long. On the claws, they have a reddish coloration on the underside, you can see here. And then they have this white patch on the claws between the two parts of the pincers. And this is where they get the name signal crayfish from. That's the signal of the name. This is another picture that shows very well the reddish coloration. You can see the signal patch just here and here. They have a much more generally smooth texture to the carapace and the claws, much more so than the native crayfish. Last year, we found this species, the Spiny-cheek crayfish, which is another one from North America. And this was in a lake at Sparsholt College. You can see here in this picture, very prominent spines on the side of its head. So this is what gives it the name Spiny-cheek crayfish. And these are sitting in front of the cervical groove here. So where you would ordinarily expect to find small spines just on white-clawed crayfish, these are in front of it and much more prominent. Now, unfortunately, these were, as I said, in a carp lake at Sparsholt College, next to some reed beds. And this is where we at the Trust, with Sparsholt College and with some colleagues from Bristol Zoological Society, had attempted to establish an ark site. Now, ark sites named after Noah's Ark, and these are, the concept is that these are locations that will be isolated, self-contained water bodies where you could release white-clawed crayfish, and from there that you could have a healthy, self-sustaining population, which would need very little ongoing management or human interference. But one of the criteria for selection of a site to be an ark site is that they need to be away from records of non-native crayfish or at low risk of colonization from such species. We released white-clawed crayfish into the reed beds there in 2016 and 17. Reed bed was monitored annually, but we were never able to re-find any white-clawed crayfish in the reed bed, which was a bit concerning, but we thought that it was quite a dense reed bed. They're probably in there somewhere, or hopefully. Then in 2021, mid one of the lockdowns, we heard from staff at Sparsholt that students had been seeing crayfish in this carp lake that was right next to the reed bed. So we thought, oh, great, the white-clawed crayfish have moved into the lake. It's not what we expected them to do, but it's good that there's something still there. And then last year we went and surveyed the lake and saw these crayfish in the shallows at the edges of the lake. And unfortunately, we immediately knew that those were not white-clawed crayfish. They were moving in an entirely different manner. So unfortunately, that means that the ark site is no longer considered an ark site. There may be white-clawed crayfish hanging on in there, but we can't consider it a safe location for them. And it really highlights the importance of biosecurity, because we were at the time also working up plans to develop a rearing facility there for native white-clawed crayfish. But then once we found the Spiny-cheek crayfish present there, it was no longer appropriate to move forward with those plans because it wasn't considered a biosecure location. We don't know how the Spiny-cheek crayfish came to be in that lake. There are no other records on Hampshire. There are not really any records in counties nearby. They don't tend to be in this part of the country. It could be that they were moved there, young crayfish moved there in water that came with carp that were moved into the lake. It could be that some were put in there as some kind of baits. We don't know. We don't know when they moved into that lake either. So as well as being more competitive and physically aggressive, both of these species, being North American species, are able to be carriers of a disease known as crayfish plague. This is a technical term, is an oomycete pathogen, also known as a water mold. So this is a microscopic organism similar to a fungus. The North American species, having evolved alongside it, have an immunity to it, but our native white-clawed crayfish don't. So when they come into contact with crayfish plague, over time it attacks their nervous system, and you can end up with mass mortality of white-clawed crayfish colonies of up to 100%, and this can occur within a matter of days or weeks. So this photograph here shows the result of a crayfish plague outbreak in a native crayfish population. As the disease continues to affect their nervous systems, it affects their ability to move, to feed, to breathe, and over time they will actually haul themselves out of the river onto the riverbanks. And it's a very visible disease when it affects native crayfish. And this is how we thought that white-clawed crayfish were no longer present within Winnall Moors, because such an event was witnessed there in the early 1990s by staff who were working there. So we know that crayfish plague moved through the site. We don't entirely know how the population at Winnall Moors survived this, whether it's a case that they were in a backwater channel which didn't have any plague come through and just managed to hang on over this time, whether somehow they moved into the site from another location. But the nearest populations we know of are a fair way upstream. We don't know that they would be able to move all that way naturally. Some possibility maybe that these individuals are the descendants of native crayfish which have managed to develop some kind of resistance or immunity to the disease, but we need a lot more evidence to be able to establish that that is the case. And the signal crayfish continue to be sort of less than a kilometre away from the white-clawed crayfish that we have at Winnall Moors. So we need to be vigilant about that population and all white-clawed populations we have in Hampshire. So the spores of crayfish plague, as well as being carried on the host species, they're able to persist for up to 16 days away from the host in damp environments. There are several potential vectors for these. As Maggie was saying, things like wet fishing equipment and clothing. They could also be carried on the fur or feathers of animals, so perhaps dogs going into rivers and swimming about, or there's a chance that a waterfowl could move it from catchment to catchment. Because the thing is that not all signal crayfish will be carrying the crayfish plague. So there may be populations which don't have it, but you could be moving the plague from a signal crayfish population which has the plague and then infecting one which doesn't, and then that goes on to spread that out to locations where we have native white-clawed crayfish. So this is really where we get to the biosecurity point of things, and why we're so keen at the Trust and other organisations to spread the message of check, clean, disinfect and dry anything that goes into a river or fresh water. So yeah, that's why we're very keen to urge regular river users, fishing clubs, other organisations such as ourselves who spend a lot of time going to and between watercourses to have a biosecurity protocol in place, even if it's a relatively simple 3-step process of check, clean, dry, as well as helping to protect against the accidental introduction and spread of non-Indigenous crayfish species. It will also help to minimise the risk of transmission of crayfish plague between sites. And then more broadly, it will protect fisheries and other sites from other fish diseases and other invasive non-native species. So you can see here, it's one of my colleagues doing something that I spend a lot of my time doing, particularly during the summer months, and I'll be doing on Thursday this week, scrubbing a pair of waders to get off as much dirt and detritus as we can. So this is a flow chart that gives details of the check, clean, dry process. Saying again what Maggie's already said, but we really need to hammer this message home. Any waders, boots, nets, fishing tackle, buckets, anything that's been into the water, before you leave the site, ideally, you need to check it for organisms and mud, because even small fragments of some invasive plants can propagate from a tiny amount of material. And obviously microscopic organisms such as crayfish plague, you wouldn't see with the naked eye, but they can persist in damp mud or water on equipment. We check them and then clean them as much as you can, also ideally at the site before you leave it, so that if there is anything already there, it just stays there, it doesn't move to another location. When we're cleaning things like the treads of waders and boots, we find that things like old toothbrushes come in very handy, sort of thick wire paper clips are good for getting into the treads of waders and getting stones and things out, and mud. Because one of the things I find is that there must be a competition amongst the designers of the treads of wellies and waders to make them as complicated and difficult to clean for people like us as possible. There's so many nooks and crannies and holes, and for no apparent reason, in the heels of waders. And I'm always having to dig stones and things out of those. So get it as clean as you possibly can on the site, and then continue to clean them away from the site, but being mindful of any runoff, and make sure that it doesn't get into any more watercourses, and then get it as dry as possible. For most people, this will be the method most available to them. Direct sunlight is a great disinfectant. Ultraviolet will kill many pathogens, and if the items become completely dry, then that reduces the likelihood that the things are going to be able to persist. You can clean it very well and sort of half dry it, but if it goes away damp and then you take them back out again, even a couple of weeks, 2-3 weeks later, and go to another site, there's the possibility that something could still be persisting on that equipment that could be spread. We at the Trust also use an intermediate stage. We use a disinfectant, an iodine-based disinfectant, to clean our equipment, because we're going out so frequently between different sites, and particularly mindful that we work on sites where white-clawed crayfish are present, but then I often go to other parts of the river where there will be signal crayfish. We use a disinfectant, soak things for at least 15 minutes, but it needs to not be seen as a silver bullet. If new batches of disinfectant aren't mixed up frequently enough, it can lose its potency over time. If it's mixed up and it's somewhat too dilute, that would also be less effective. So even though we use a disinfectant on our kit, getting it dry afterwards is the real key. This flowchart also talks about a hot water treatment, so immersing items in 45-degree water or more. There are trials going on to see actually how effective this is at denaturing crayfish plague, and there's a certain amount of debate as to how effective that actually is. So although it's part of this flowchart, in terms of our crayfish work, we use the left-hand side, or just straight down the middle. So after check, clean, dry, I'll just finish off with one more slogan, and that's spread the word, not the problem. So tell your friends, tell other people you know who are going out into the rivers about the check, clean, dry, about the need to be biosecure, and we can hopefully reduce the rate at which these species are spreading through our watercourses.
I think for me, having worked on rivers for 40 plus years, and I've seen some of these critters arrive and the impact they have on ecology, and how quickly and how well some non-natives can do. And as Maggie has said, we've been very good at exporting our own non-natives, and the little spotty fish that's on my badge, the brown trout, the Victorians did their absolute best to spread that fish to the four corners of the planet. And they were very determined, taking trout eggs down to New Zealand in ships in moss and ice. And subsequently, those trout have done very, very well in some of the rivers in the Southern Hemisphere, and to the detriment of some of the native species that were in those systems before. And it's funny how the passage of time sometimes changes our views on non-natives, and whether or not they become naturalized, and whether they're valuable or not, in which case people seem to shrug their shoulders and think, oh, well, this is quite a good thing. And a classic example of that might be on the River Itchen, where everyone might think that the grayling is a chalk stream fish. Well, there were no grayling in the River Itchen until the 1980s, until the National Rivers Authority introduced them at the time, which was quite an interesting thing to do. But grayling were absent from both the Test and the Itchen, and they're an indigenous, rivers like the East Coast rivers, like the Trent and the Thames, were once tributaries of the Rhine, and they've got a similar natural fish fauna. Those fish are freshwater fish, and many of the fish that initially populated the south, southwest, and the western coast rivers were virtually all sea run fish. So the trout that we get, the native brown trout, were in fact populated by sea trout. And of course, we've done our absolute best on most of our rivers to lock migratory fish out through the building of mills and structures for the last probably 2,000 years. And we've also mucked about with the populations enormously by introducing things that we like. It opened my eyes a bit. You know, I was watching Wild Isles. I'm sure we're all watching Wild Isles with fascination. And it tears my hair out there where we see native English, British species they're feeding. And the osprey always seems to find a rainbow trout, a North American species, not a native UK species. Now, how's that happened? Well, that's because we shunt them around and we stock them out all over the place, including still in some stretches of the rivers Test and Itchen, which I think is terribly sad. The other thing I would say, and just filling in a few gaps to pick up on the signal crayfish thing, and there's some good news and bad news there with regard to signals. They have been in some of our chalk rivers in the south from the very, very earliest times that they were in the UK. The Hampshire Avon, I think even earlier than the 70s, the late 60s. Yet their density is fairly low, and their environmental impact seems to be quite low in the Avon compared to some of the Thames Valley rivers and the Cotswold rivers, where the densities are astronomical, and the impact that they have, not just on other species, but actually the shape of the river channel. Because unlike our native crayfish, obviously they're bank burrowers. They don't live under stones and in root systems. They literally dig holes in the bank. And as a result, rivers that are polluted with signal crayfish over time tend to get a little bit wider as banks slump and erode, particularly when they're clay streams. Now here we've got chalk rivers. They're shallow banks, gravelly, often with tussocky fringes. The thicker your fringe of tussocky sedge in a very shallow margin is, which is great chalk stream habitat, the worse it is for a signal crayfish. So I think we can think a little bit about how we manage and maintain our chalk streams to make them less desirable for the unwelcome visitors and a little bit better for our own species. And as far as the natives are concerned, I think it's fantastic that a little population has been found on Winnell. And I was really interested to hear that they fell out of the root ball of a willow. Well, we spend most of our time in the Wild Trout Trust folding willows and root balls into channels because we know what fantastic habitat they are for so many species. And obviously our own native crayfish are well adapted to those environments. They love those root systems to get into, and they're equally brilliant for fish as well. So I'm all for that. Just a little bit of a heads up about a few things that you may not have heard about. There's a DEFRA group called CFAS, which is a Centre for the Environment and Fisheries Aquaculture. They do some monitoring on our rivers each year. They're absolutely terrified that we are going to get a little bug called Gyrodactylus salaris. It's present in mainland Europe, and it's decimated, or it has the potential to decimate salmon stocks. And we know that down here we've got 2 of only 6 chalk stream salmon populations in the world, and they are on their knees at the moment. And the thought of them getting a new bug would be catastrophic. And I think CFAS are monitoring some of these key rivers annually to make sure that this bug isn't turning up. Now, one of the concerns and worries again is that it's a bug that does reasonably well on trout. We all know that trout are not only just stocked and moved about nationally, they also are coming over the North Sea as well. So it's a constant vigil to make sure that we don't get this new salmon disease, which would be catastrophic. I mentioned briefly a few others. People probably don't know that we've got them in the river test system, but Topmouth gudgeon, motherless minnows, the threat that these particular tiny little species pose on our rivers would appear to be probably not as serious as we first thought they might be. And this is the classic example of what happens sometimes when the non-native gets into a new native environment and then nature fights back. Initially, you get this surge of the non-natives doing extremely well when everything else around doesn't know how to cope. But what happens very often with some of these fish species is that, especially when you're really small, you suddenly become food. You can become food for birds and you become food for other fish. And once they've worked you out and know all about you and how you work, then they start to eat you. And then you get that sort of little balance starts to come. So, but that doesn't rule out the fact that we should do absolutely everything in our power to raise awareness about the problems and issues that non-native species can have on our native flora and fauna. I could bore you for England with lots of fish diseases and examples of some that have caused problems in Hampshire, not on the test and the itching, but the Hampshire raven is one which native fish populations there, particularly, funnily enough, the coarse fish, suffered terribly from a gut parasite called Pomphorhynchus, although I think its name might have changed lately. Scientists love to change the names of bugs. I don't know why, but they do. But it's a little gut worm. It really did debilitate Hampshire raven chub and day stocks for a decade or more. But they've got used to the bug's got used to them. They've still got the bug, but you would never know it now. They all seem to live in harmony. But again, I would reiterate, when you do get new diseases arrive and new parasites arrive to naive populations, then you often see a massive impact. And you just hope that your population is resilient enough to be able to cope with it.